Straws off the camel's back. You need to find your own solutions, what works for you, because there is no one-size-fits-all. Cause-based approaches. Cause-based approaches attempt to look at various possible underlying causes of various symptoms of autism and other related developmental conditions. Usually, this is with a view to avoiding or lessening the plot of working with the condition of autism. Cause-based approaches look at identifying the straws on the camel's back and finding out how to remove them, rather than teaching the camel to act as though it doesn't have those straws on its back, or teaching it to walk normally in spite of its heavy load. One of the problems of some cause-based approaches is that they assume a single type of autism with a variety of underlying causes when, in my experience, there are several different types of autism and sometimes more than one type of autism present. People ask, what does this label mean then? They are generally directed to look at its description, its symptoms. They look at its appearances rather than considering it by its experience. The description of something tells you a whole load of more what, and all that what doesn't mean a lot. Some people get a diagnosis and they are handed a label. They might look for more and they get descriptions of symptoms that go with the label. For many, that doesn't get them anywhere. What puts a name to something that you maybe didn't have a name to, but it doesn't tell you anything you aren't already experiencing. It doesn't tell you what the what is made up of. It doesn't tell you what caused things that the what is made up of. It doesn't tell you what to do about the what. It doesn't even really give you any idea of where to go or who to ask about the what. Always dare to experiment. Try out new approaches. Throw out what doesn't work and keep what works. You have your own specific needs and therefore you need your own specific toolbox. It is very empowering when you find out when something works and you can use that for a better quality of life. Whilst certain branches of psychiatry or psychology or neurology have some idea about these things in communicatively able adults, there is a general lack of understanding of them in children and functionally nonverbal adults, in whom these conditions may be seriously compromising their ability to communicate and the formation of identity and the ability to interact socially. I have heard from many people who deal with their own serious difficulties with social interaction and communication and have sensory, perceptual, attention, obsessive, compulsive or phobic difficulties that cause them to display autistic behaviors, who are denied a referral on the grounds that they couldn't be autistic because they don't fit these stereotypes. One such woman who has an autistic son and whose mother also appears to have had Asperger's syndrome, a high-functioning relative to autism, approached a professional with a view to getting a diagnosis for herself for problems she shared in common with her son and mother. She was turned away because she cried during the consultation and was therefore considered to have expressed too much emotion, to have been autistic. Other people have been turned away because they have a wider range of interests or more acquaintances than the stereotypes portray, or because, like many people diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, they complain of having an overactive imagination that distracts. These attitudes did injustice not only to those people who did not fit these stereotypes, but also to those people who did appear to display these things. Though unexpressed, some of these people did have empathy, emotions, a sense of pain, a sense of humor, imagination, and interest and curiosity. Their otherwise bizarre behaviors not only made sense to them, but in some cases were actually adaptations they discovered to help them to make connections, calm themselves down, and remain in control better than they may otherwise have been able to. People with autism appear to move and behave differently in response to their surroundings, quite differently from any expected non-autistic way of moving and behaving. Rather than acknowledging that these might simply be different ways of moving and behaving, people generally assumed them to be incomprehensible and therefore unquestioningly bizarre. And this became autistic people engaged in bizarre movements and behaviors. And then you wonder why autistics get traumatized. All this shaming and then trying to make autistics behave in a neurotypical way, preventing them from expressing themselves or finding their own solutions to cope with an environment that was designed by neurotypicals. Quote, chronic invalidation can lead to an oversensitive danger alarm in the body-mind waiting to be activated by the smallest trigger. We have much to learn from autism in this regard because the humanly erosive process of chronic invalidation is constantly at work through stigma and stigmatizing micro-events that can make us feel like crawling under a rock, or even aliens on this planet. Whenever conventional beliefs are challenged, there is resistance from society, especially by authoritative experts, whose opinions are based on established convention. Feeling judged and dismissed amplifies existing emotional regulation issues, providing a model that illustrates the cycle. Accumulated experiences of invalidation related to abuse, neglect, and stigma, as well as other violating assaults on our personhood, can cause trauma to build up in our body. This leads to heightened safety distress or defensive physiological escalation triggered by the organism's need for safety, which may or may not be conscious. When overactivated, such safety distress can trigger a cascade of difficulties, including emotional escalation and flustering that worsens whatever challenges of autisticity may already be present. Trauma is not always so extreme and is not necessarily related to single catastrophic events. It can also be associated with poverty, harassment, bullying, loss, and chronic invalidation. Trauma can be perpetuated by self-bereavement and complicated when it involves repeated exposure over time, such as ongoing abuse, disregard, neglect, and being forced or choosing to endure a toxic or oppressive environment. Such trauma is often referred to as complex trauma. Judith Herman is often credited with first articulating this in her seminal book Trauma and Recovery. She specifically mentions prolonged terrors such as captivity, child abuse, and spousal abuse as sources of this kind of trauma, and talks about a new diagnosis called complex PTSD. This formulation has not been officially accepted in the DSM, unfortunately. My autism-related difficulties took me on a journey where my physical health fell apart from a combination of inherited faults, bad management, and the chronic stress of dealing with an incomprehending world, which taught this camel to walk straight instead of taking the lorry load of straws off its back for the 30 years before it realized there was a choice. These are the reasons why, to me, there is no single thing called autism. Some camels have a lot of one type of straw on their backs. Some camels have a whole collection of different types of straws on their back. From knowing all these things, I have been able to weed my own garden, to sort through the difference between what is useful, feels good, or feels like me, and what is counterproductive, doesn't feel right, and doesn't feel like me. Where I could get the weeds out, I did. Where I couldn't, I looked for what might have caused the weeds in the hope of undoing their cause. What we need to come away from is that rigid thinking that one size fits all. It's not like that. There are individual needs and therefore individual solutions. And neurotypicals, even if they call themselves experts, don't really know what an autistic needs, because they don't experience the environment in the way an autistic does. Therefore, I say again, find your own solutions and throw away what doesn't work.